So, hi everybody, I'm Jill Rutter. As Alan said, I work with those two think tanks, with Anand Menon and Hannah White, who I think you've all met already. But actually, I am also a former civil servant, so that sort of reflects my views. I'm not an academic like some of these other people you've had talking to you. And as Alan said, I've been asked to talk about Proposition C and D, that government should always fulfil their manifesto commitments, but that on big issues we should proceed on the basis of broad agreement. And on the face of it, I think we could say they both look like complete no-brainers. What's not to like? But as you will also have spotted, and I think earlier speakers pointed out, there's a bit of a conflict with each other. Parties run on very distinctive platforms, so compromise would mean someone or other having to water down their commitments. So let's get stuck in and explore a bit more about what we might think about this. So let's start with manifesto. Those manifestos, those are the documents that parties publish when they run for election. And it might surprise you that actually academics who've looked at this say that UK governments are, to use a turn of phrase the Prime Minister quite likes, world beating, at least well up there when it comes to meeting their manifesto commitments. But what are these manifestos? What are they? You could regard them as advertisements for the political parties, or even sort of contract offers from governments to the people who are going to vote for them. They set out the sort of government they're going to be if I give them my vote. And we have rules against misleading advertising introduced by those very same politicians to try to ensure that when I buy what I think is a fuel-efficient car, I don't end up with a gas guzzler. And we hold people to contracts if they don't fulfill their side of the bargain. So surely we should apply that to the politicians who impose those rules as well. Should we regard manifestos like that? Don't know if you remember back to the 2019 election, but I think if I'd voted for Boris Johnson in that election on the basis that he would get Brexit done, I might have been pretty miffed if he had announced on the steps of Downing Street, as he'd won the election, that he'd written another of his famous articles and decided that after all, it was all a horrible mistake and we were going to stay EU members. So that's a sort of manifesto commitment I think we wouldn't expect a government to break. But there was a lot more in that Conservative manifesto. It was over 20,000 words long. The Labour one was much the same length. Don't know that anyone counted how many commitments were in that manifesto, but in 2015, the civil service counted the number in David Cameron's manifesto, and that had over 500 commitments in it. Most people would only remember one or two at best. Should we really expect the government to do all of those? Well, there's a bad reason why they might not. And that reason is they never meant to in the first place, that the commitments were just put in there for internal party reasons or to please somebody. I always remember that when colleagues of mine at the Institute for Government did some research back in 1990, back about the transition to the new Labour government in 1997, Tony Blair's former chief of staff expressed surprise at the fact that the civil service had presented them with plans on how to implement all their manifesto commitments. He said, no, those are just in the manifesto. We don't intend to do those. He was surprised they'd taken their manifesto at face value. That's a bad reason for not doing things. But let's try some more defensible reasons about why we might not want the government slavishly to work through its manifesto commitments like you might expect your kids to do their homework. First of all, that just overtaken by events. Think back again to 2019. In December 2019, when Boris Johnson was elected, we knew he had to do something about Brexit, but we didn't know that he was going to spend the next year and a half plus struggling with a pandemic. It's not predicted and not planned for. It's had huge impacts on the public finances. Does it make sense then to hold the government to commitments they made in incredibly difficult circumstances? The government indeed has already said it's going to break a manifesto commitment, the one about taxation, in order to deal with that NHS backlog, and it hopes also fund social care. Second, reality hits. When governments come in from opposition, remember, we've had some governments that have been out of power for a long time. They really haven't had access to the government machine to know whether their ideas that look good on paper will actually work in practice. Some of them don't look very good when you get into government. Should they go on regardless? And what about those policies? That was a point being made earlier, that have taken a battering during the election campaign or when they're introduced into Parliament. Remember Theresa May and her famous plan for social care. Should politicians really just go on because it was in the manifesto, even though lots and lots of people have said they think it looks like a really bad idea? And third, new problems emerge. What seemed important at the time that government was fighting for election seems much less important, and governments are limited by time, money, and just bandwidth, the ability to think about things. So those are reasons you might not want to proceed with your manifesto commitments. But another reason is that you want to reach out. You want to take account of views beyond the party and try to get some sort of broader agreement. That might be formal, like the negotiations we had back in 2010 to form the coalition government under David Cameron and Nick Clegg and create a joint programme for government. Remember there, the Liberal Democrats gave up some of their manifesto commitments. People weren't very wild about that, but that was a government based on a much broader agreement than a single party government and a much bigger share of the electorate. There can be good reasons why you want a bit more stability in policy. It's a long-term issue like climate change. Implementation takes time, won't happen during one parliament. Businesses, services, citizens don't want policies that chop and change. Those all come with big costs. Those are quite good reasons for looking for agreement. There's a bad reason as well, that politicians might want political cover for difficult decisions or be able to blame their opponents for inaction. And some of what we've seen going on social care is precisely about that. But why might it make sense to act without broad agreement? Firstly, it slows things down. Sometimes it's just better to act fast than go at the pace of the slowest. And sometimes something is better than nothing. It stops leadership. I want you to think about this. There are some big changes where government gets out ahead, not only of the other parties, but of public opinion, but then they follow. Think about the congestion charge. We have it in London, where Ken Livingstone as mayor got out ahead. Manchester put it to a public vote and doesn't have a congestion charge. Certainly think in London, the traffic problems would be much worse if we didn't have a congestion charge. Other ideas weren't supported by the other party at the time, but became part of the accepted wisdom. Privatisation, quite controversial in some places, or the minimum wage, opposed by the Conservatives when it was introduced. But then after 18 months, they changed their mind and thought it was a good idea. They did the same on Bank of England independence. Or another idea, same-sex marriage. David Cameron took that forward without even agreement within his own party. Very controversial, a lot of the party membership, but he thought it was the right thing to do. And a lot of the people who opposed him at the time now admit that they were wrong. And I don't think anyone necessarily wants to go back on that. And there's a real risk that if we insist that everything just goes by broad agreement, we actually end up with policies no one's satisfied with. Just think about where the broad agreement might have been on Brexit. Would it really have been better to be in a halfway house rather than either fully in or fully out? A lot of people thought that actually that middle ground was the worst of all worlds rather than a sensible compromise. So as you think about this and these two statements, you might want to ask yourselves, when do I want politicians to choose compromise over going forward with commitments they have made? Are there sorts of issues where one of those things, the agreement or the going forward, sticking to your commitments, is more important than the other? And how, and this goes back to what Meg was saying earlier, and how, when politicians decide they're going one way or the other, do I want them to explain those choices to me?